Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session on burnout and stress. And I want to start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which I sit, which is the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation in Victoria, Australia, and welcome everyone from wherever you are. Just to let you know that we have slightly changed the title of this presentation. I'm just going to share my screen now. To also encompass the notion of trauma. So at the Dart Centre, our primary focus is supporting journalists and newsrooms to become trauma aware and trauma literate. And we want to especially acknowledge that journalists working in investigative work very often are working on stories that deal with uncovering a lot of trauma. So we want to add that to the mix, though of course we will be talking about burnout and stress. So how this session is going to go is I'm just going to give you a little tiny frame to begin with. I'm with the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma as a Deputy Managing Director. I'm standing in for Kate McMahon, who is our Managing Director, who unfortunately has needed to attend some sorry business and so hasn't been able to come today. I'm also a former journalist from some time ago before I've kind of moved into a new career working in this kind of role and as a psychologist. So I'm going to give a little frame about burnout, stress and trauma, and then we've got two fantastic journalists to join us today, Rowena, Pereira and Amantha Pereira, who are going to sort of talk a lot about their own personal experiences with these issues and some ideas to support you guys. And we'd love to have some really great conversation as we're going. So just to start off, really acknowledging that the work that you do is so important and also involves a lot of risk. And the risk is sometimes known and sometimes not known. And sometimes the nature of news, it's unexpected. Even when you're working on kind of long-term projects where you do have some kind of sense of where you're going and the kind of reporting that you're doing, there is always that risk that you will expose yourself to extreme stress and trauma. And so why do we think it's important that you learn about this thing? Well, mostly it's about becoming healthy yourself and staying healthy yourself and staying resilient. It's also about really being able to understand your personal responses to the information you gather, understand the responses of the talent and the news sources that you might be talking to, and to build and present the story in a way that has the most impact without causing any damage to yourself or to your audience for that matter, or of course to the people that you've relied on to help you gather the news. We also think that for your employers, it's about a legal and ethical duty of care to make sure that you are as strong as you are as can be and as resilient as you can be. And we think that when that happens, we actually have a stronger press, a stronger democracy for those of us who are working in democracies, and for a real vibrant media. And that's what we need, obviously, to uncover some of the things that we need to uncover. But what is burnout? Burnout is actually a very specific syndrome. It's chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It's got three dimensions. There's a real sense of energy depletion or exhaustion, a sense of mental distance from one's job, or cynicism or negativism related to your job. And that's kind of really relevant as we get to kind of later in our kind of discussion, where we're talking about the importance of having a kind of goal or a mission as being a protective factor. And burnout also results in reduced professional efficiency. So you're just not as good as you once were. And it's not to do with your capability, it's got to do with this kind of layer of long-term chronic stress that has not been managed. So it really does relate to kind of work. You can probably burn out in other areas of your life, but as a sort of syndrome, it's really conceptualized as a work-related issue. Stress, on the other hand, can be from anywhere. It can be just daily hassles, just financial difficulties, or maybe some issues with your family or health issues, anything that can occur in your life. And again, it's when you have the resources that you have to respond to those things are not as great as the stress itself. So it's not only related to work. And so when we're looking about, how to work in as a professional, but in this case as a journalist, and when I say journalist, I mean everybody involved in the news gathering and reporting, there's this kind of sense where you do need a bit of stress. You do need a little bit of kind of energy or kind of pressure to motivate you. If the deadline's kind of like sometime in the future, then getting the energy to kind of do the work today is much harder than if we're right on and it's got to be produced in the next 24 hours or whatever it might be. So there's this kind of learning or growth zone or comfort zone where you're really optimal functioning. There actually is some stress in your life and it's enabling and supporting you to perform. But on the other hand, if that goes too far, then you end up in the distress zone and you end up with fatigue, anxiety, and potentially burnout. Trauma is a different concept altogether. It's related in some ways, but it is slightly different in that it involves life threat or extreme violence. And so it's not just about stress. It's about a kind of an event that happens where there is, at some underlying level, there's some underlying threat to life. When you experience trauma, when you witness it, or even if you hear about it or interview someone who's experienced it and they're telling you the story about what happened, your body goes into emergency mode. And that's a protection mechanism. There's a whole bunch of brain chemistry that goes on. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on that are very, very normal, physical and emotional, physiological and psychological. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to always fall apart as a result, but to acknowledge that this is a kind of normal thing to happen when you see something kind of coming towards you that is a danger, your body will actually react in a different way than it would otherwise do. So there is a relationship, though, between stress and trauma, and that is depending on how resilient you are, how much stress you have in your life will influence the result of the trauma exposure. I'll explain it in a minute. Just imagine if you've got like a lot of deadlines, you've got a sick child, you're going through a divorce, there's some kind of job loss that might be going on for you or a change. And all of these have different levels of stress in your kind of containers, in your kind of ability to handle things. And then on top of that level of stress, you cover some events that involve trauma. So they might go down to where there's been a bombing at a market. You might talk to someone who's a survivor of rape. You might witness or experience a story in relation to a dead child, or you might personally receive a death threat. And eventually this gets to a point where your stress levels underneath are so you've already used up a lot of your kind of coping resources. And so that final trauma, that event that comes in on top of that is enough to send you into sort of some potentially longer term damage. So it's actually about managing your stress protects you in relation to any trauma exposure that you might have. Because if you have lower levels of a kind of underlying stress, then any trauma is more easily able to be coped with, or you're more able to be resilient to it. On the other hand, if you're already in burnout mode, which as we've talked about before is that kind of extreme and chronic workplace stress, then you are very much at risk if you are covering stories that involve trauma. So there are protective mechanisms for trauma reporting and for building your own resilience. And there's 3 areas that I want to just kind of touch on, and then we'll get back into them a lot more in relation to our discussion later. The first one is social connection. This doesn't have to be just colleagues. It can be with your friends, with your family. But, human beings are social creatures and we feel safe when we are with others, providing, of course, they're safe people. So make sure as you're going through your career, as you're going through difficult stories, make sure you continue to build those social relationships. The second one is exercise and physicality. And the reason for that is trauma, stress, burnout, they're all experienced in our body, as I mentioned before. And so we need to move that energy, move those hormones out of the body. And the best way to do that is with some kind of physical exercise. It can be whatever works for you. The last one, this third picture down here, it's not really so clear what it is, but it is actually about having a sense of purpose, having a really clear direction as to why you're doing the work that you are doing. And that's what's really fantastic about you people, because you already probably have a really strong anchor for that. When you're working on a long-term investigation or you're working as an investigative journalist, I would guess that you have a really clear sense of mission throughout your work as to why you're kind of working so hard and digging so deep into the areas that you're digging. So those three areas, if you just hang on to those as thoughts, and we'll come back to them later on in the conversation, hopefully. So now I would like to introduce Rowena Pereira, who is an amazing investigative journalist from the Philippines. She's a Dart Centre Fellow. She has 30 plus years of incredible experience, and I'd like to introduce her and welcome her to talk about your experience when with the COVID-19 pandemic and how that impacts on stress and burnout.
Thank you, Camina. Okay, as Camina has discussed, journalism, especially investigative journalism, has always been a stress-laden field of work. And whether you are a field reporter or someone who is part of the so-called Digital Frontline, stress is always just a few stories away. And now, the COVID-19 pandemic, which continues to be a major concern, has added a further dimension to the mental health risks being faced by working journalists in many countries. My discussion will be mainly in the context of places like the Philippines, where the face shield, not just the face mask, is still a requirement when going to public places. These photos show the contrast of how journalists used to be and how they are now today. When before you can sit together, work together, go out together anywhere you like, now you usually have to work by yourself, often at home. And if you do go out and cover, it is with all the necessary precautions of face masks, face shields, sometimes even PPEs or protective personal equipment, having limited number of people in the vehicle, being very careful in entering small spaces or crowded areas. So the restrictions that are still in place in many areas make it really very difficult to be with your peers, with your colleagues. And before, when you need to do an investigative report, going out for field coverage is the automatic thing to do. Go to your sources, find offices that need documents, find people to interview, go to the scenes of the incident. But these were the normal things to do. But now the virus has forced us to do some of them digitally, and then and try to minimize the field work. Aside from the isolation, there's also the relentlessness. Disasters usually last only for a few days or even just a few weeks. But with the pandemic, however, it is very different, both in terms of length of time and the geographical reach. It has lasted for over a year and it is global. So no matter where you go, it is there. There's also, we can say, enduring appeal to the issue. Unlike disaster stories, which according to studies are intensely followed by news consumers just for the first few days, and then there's a rapid decline in the interest. But with the pandemic, the demand for information is continuous. So the demand for journalists to work is also higher. So what has the pandemic brought us? The pandemic has resulted in the loss of normalcy, both in our personal and our work life. The loss of connection, the things that we normally do with friends, we could hardly do now. And literally, we cannot hug, touch, embrace people that we want to touch because of the restrictions and because you also don't want them to to contract the virus in case you're the one carrying. So there's also that loss of sense of safety. And then because the lockdown has also affected the income of newspapers and other news organizations, there's also the fear of economic toll. In the Philippines, there are newspapers that have shut down because of this. And aside from that, there are freelancers who are suffering because they are under a no work, no pay situation. So while journalists may be protected by the PPEs for the physical issues, the mental health is something that has to be given a different kind of protection. The ones in the slide are questions that journalists themselves have raised. No? So doing face-to-face or Zoom interview, going to field coverage, or maybe just request the source for a video or the photos. These questions reflect how the pandemic has changed the usual way we get our information or how we deal with our sources. Either the journalist or the source is unable or unwilling to do in-person interviews. Online now has become the norm in many newsrooms. And this is actually has made it more difficult, especially if you're doing investigative reports. Sometimes you have these difficult questions and you're looking for the right timing, and you usually base this on the reaction of your interviewee, the body language. But with the online interviews, these are things that are difficult to see, no? So, and then the question of internet connection, or do you make lunch first, or do you do online interview or online research? And then it's already 9:00. How do I answer that call? These are questions that are related to work from home situations that many journalists are facing. Limited resources such as good internet connection, and that's the main problem here in the Philippines and many Southeast Asian countries. And then you have to wear several hats, and sometimes the other household members don't understand that even if you're at home, you're actually still at work. And then the issue of conflicting protocol requirements. Sometimes you talk to the provincial level, they have a different requirement. When you go to the village, they have a different requirement. So it adds to the stress of the journalist. And then questions like, am I doing the best for my investigative story? Am I still a journalist? I don't know if you encounter these questions in your own areas, but these are concerns of concerns of working from home, the difficulties in the coverage, problem with resources. These all bring doubts on the stories that are made or are published and the capability as a journalist. And we also have some journalists who are more used to the traditional way of getting information as opposed to the digital way, which the pandemic has highlighted. And they now ask themselves if they should still be journalists. And then we have journalists who have this Superman complex and feels that he should be able to do the investigative reports despite all the limitations. And when they are unable to do this, they feel that they have let the newsroom down or the public down. So these are questions and they are reflections of how the pandemic has actually added to the stress, added to the trauma, which are already there before the virus came, but which are heightened because of the additional difficulties, the additional mental challenges that journalists face, especially investigative journalists. Going on field coverage have additional challenges. No? Aside from the protocols, there's the difficulty in communication, because you have to follow these rules, no? Like you have to be 2 meters away from your interviewee. So how do you look at the eyes? We are always taught to look at the eyes, to have an eye contact. But how do you do that? And then you have a mask, you have a face shield, and so on. So it makes it very difficult in communication on both parts, the interviewee and the journalist. It's also difficult to build the trust between you and your sources because of the difficulty in communication. Then it's not in the slide, but the issue of empathic engagement is even more important, or comes out even stronger during field coverage. No? In general, we often cannot help having empathic engagement with traumatized communities, especially if it's your own community you are covering. And then there are parts of the public who are agents of moral harm, and there are fears that the publication of certain issues or certain positions could enable it, leading to the sources being bashed online or even physically threatened. So going to communities might also bring the virus to them and exposing your sources. No? So these are all things that sometimes bring guilt on the part of the journalist. And several studies have shown journalists conveying feelings of guilt and helplessness when confronted by the grief, the economic hardships, the emotional fragility. For example, when you see patients being turned away from hospitals because there is simply no more bed available, or curfew violators who are made to squat 300 times and one actually died the following day, or those who were made to sit inside a doghouse, or LGBTQ members being made to dance and kiss in front of the police officers who arrested them as a punishment for their quarantine violation. If you keep seeing this every day, all of these affect journalists. Their moral and ethical standards are challenged, leading to sometimes moral injury and the feeling of not being able to do enough. And it has come to a point that there are some reporters that have actually requested to be transferred assignments, from covering pandemic-related issues. They actually requested something that's more less controversial, more peaceful. The one journalist, for example, every time she would hear an ambulance siren, she would start shivering. And this is not usual for journalists, because we thrive on threats. We go to volcano community when the volcano erupts. So this is unusual to have somebody ask for transfer. This photo, the one in red is a broadcast reporter. And during the pandemic, he visited his family only twice for fear of bringing home the virus. I myself visited my mother only 3 months after the lockdown was declared in Manila, for the same reason. And being away from your family, your main support system, and not being with your friends because of the restrictions and the fear of being the cause of them getting the virus, these are heavy burdens for most of us. And remember that all of this is happening under a situation wherein there's so much disinformation and attacks against journalists continue in places like the Philippines, Myanmar, and other areas in Southeast Asia. So let's flatten that stress curve, or let's add stress and trauma curve. These are only a few tips. They are specific to journalism under the situation of the COVID-19 pandemic. So first, let's fight the isolation. Let's find a way to keep in touch with friends, to talk to someone. Even during the height of the lockdown, it was actually Kate McMahon, because I asked him, how do you keep that connection? What can I tell journalists in the Philippines on what to do given these restrictions? And she suggested, you have a Friday night drinking session bring your own wine and use Zoom or whatever online platform you can use. So you can still exchange stories, you can still see each other's faces, still smile. And then when the situation is better, you can go and hug each other. But find a way to talk to friends to find that connection. Peer support is always effective. We've had this trauma peer support network in the Philippines, and I believe other countries have also tried it, and it has always been very helpful for journalists. Next is communicate. Express your need out loud, clearly and firmly. We need to tell our bosses what we need. We need to tell them that you do not want to get calls at 9 in the evening. We have to tell our family to let us be when we are at work. We have to tell our friends that we need their support. So we have to communicate what we need. Work for balance, personal vis-a-vis work. Set up boundaries. When it's time for personal, you do not let work interfere, and vice versa. Be kind to yourself, give in to the needs of your mind and body. Get that ice cream that you want. Treat yourself. Take short breaks, take long breaks, listen to your body, disconnect if needed. And then recognize that your health, your mental health, is not just your concern, but the news organizations as well. It is the responsibility of the entire newsroom, not just the individual. And programs and measures should be put in place to help the journalists. In a survey conducted, the lack of organizational support is one of the major factors for stress. I'm also a strong believer in collective action. Somebody said, don't let a good crisis go to waste. So let's use this opportunity to talk about mental health, to push for policies that would help address the issue of mental health in the company, in our newsroom, and even in your town, in your area. I think this is a good opportunity. This is the time to do it, because prior to the pandemic, there were discussions about mental health, but a lot of them wasn't getting any traction. But now people are more open to talking about it. And that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Wing. Samantha Pereira is my colleague at the Dart Centre Asia Pacific and has a long and distinguished career also as a journalist, starting in his native Sri Lanka and now moving to Australia. He's our regional coordinator for the Dart Centre Asia Pacific and has just submitted his master's research in the risks and experiences of journalists reporting online during COVID. So I think you're going to broaden it out and talk more generally also, Amantha. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kamina. When Weng started her presentation, I heard one phrase that struck me as connecting what I'm trying to speak about right now and what she just elaborated quite, deeply. She used the term digital frontline. Now, the word frontline was something that I used to hear quite often when I was in probably the formative years of my journalism, but covering something which was dangerous, but also quite intimate to me. I was covering the civil war in my native Sri Lanka, which was not a story that was alien to me. It was a story that I was living as a Sri Lankan living in Sri Lanka. So I would not only be reporting, but I would also be in that story context. And I would listen, I would regularly overhear this word frontline. We're going to the front line because I was based in the capital and you would have to go to the front line. And now what did the front line mean? The front line actually meant where there was the risk of very real physical danger, be it bombs, guns, conflict, all that. And I remember very clearly that as you travel north, you got this sense that you were nearing the front line, that you were getting close to it. You got signs. The civilian life decreased and signs of militarization increased. So you were getting these visual signs and signposts that you were reaching the front line. Now, what's the difference today? Right? What's the difference with the digital front line? In the morning, I get up, I go to my living area, I'll get my kids ready to school, drop them off, come back. I open my door to a room that is more of a study room for my kids than a work room, and I sit in front of my computer. Now, that's the digital front line. And that is where we are right now. But even though there are signs of nearing the digital front line, nearing the dangers of the digital front line are not as dramatic and clear as what I used to see when I traveled up north to cover the conflict. The dangers probably are equally dangerous and equally important as what we faced earlier in my reporting career. I would want to start off by saying that what has happened in the last 23 months since the lockdown, since remote working became a global phenomenon, is that we have become reliant on the digital frontline, on digital resources for our journalists. This is not to say that we weren't before the pandemic, before the lockdowns, but that the pivot has been more acute and the dependence on digital tools and online tools is now universal. It doesn't really matter where you are. You could be covering a story from a remote part in Sri Lanka, or you could be doing some work from Melbourne. But you both of those journalists could be equally reliant on online tools. So I want to start off by saying that treat the online environment as a hostile or potentially hostile reporting environment. Like if you would approach a hostile reporting environment, which is physical, it could be civil conflict, it could be a post-natural disaster scene, but we make preparations. Likewise, when every time now we sit or now we engage the digital frontline, prepare ourselves, we need to prepare ourselves that this could be a potentially hostile reporting environment. And that environment is relentless. It doesn't take a break. It is fast. It is very, very fast. And it is also isolating. The isolation is now emphasized because of the way our work environment has changed in the last year and a half. We are in remote working conditions. We don't have the mobility we used to have. So because of that, physically we feel isolated. So that isolation is now emphasized. Now, the other thing is that these online dangers, they can be unobtrusive. They are not like the signposts that I used to see when I was traveling to the northern conflict zone. There is not going to be a big sign saying beyond this area, it's army controlled area. No, there are no signs that says be careful of landmines with the skull and bone. There is nothing like that. You could be on your Twitter feed and there could be these threats. You could be looking at Facebook, there could be threats. You could be looking at some information, graphics, images that you have got, and this threat is there. So it can be unobtrusive. You may feel that it's not happening, and the onset is very, very slow. This is not a sudden dramatic thing. It can happen, but usually it is very, very slow and onsetting. But what we have seen is that the realization, the impact can be sudden and dramatic. And in my conversations with journalists that I've had in the last year and a half, but I have come to realize is that when colleagues realize how much this impact is, then suddenly there is this kind of light bulb that goes on oh, we need to be careful. We need to do things differently so that we are careful in this environment, in this reporting environment, which we weren't as careful before. The online environment is very, very dynamic. It changes. The kind of threats that we face change, their manifestations change, their exposure levels change. Very simple example. Before the lockdowns, some of us would not be spending this many hours online for our work. Now that we have, whether we like it or not, because for our job, the exposure levels to these threats have gone up, right? So, and they're very dynamic. During my work with the Dart Center, what we have kind of also realized is that in the last year and a half, journalists have become more aware or sensitive to the impact of fake news and inauthentic information has on their job. So Kamina started our session by saying, give your work purpose. What we do as journalists has value because we give information to our communities that will help them to make informed decisions. And in this case, they could be life-saving decisions. What fake news has done is that it actually undermines that purpose. So like I said, these threats are dynamic, they're changing. We understand most of these parts. There are different parts that are moving, but we really are just seeing or just beginning to understand the impact and the influences of these moving parts on our work, on our job, and also on ourselves. So three very simple things. I mean, I always try to look at how we would approach a physical danger, a dangerous reporting environment. Say, suddenly we have to go and cover a protest. We prepare ourselves. You know, if you don't know the city, we will look at where the protest is, what are the roads that are leading into the site, where can we go out, who are the people who are coming, is there going to be any chance of police reaction? Will that reaction be tear gas? If it's going to be tear gas, how are we going to prepare for that? We prepare ourselves in a way that facing up to these dangers, we can do our job. So likewise, we have to prepare ourselves to go out to the digital front line and do our job, not to disengage, but to equip ourselves, to skill ourselves to do that. And first is to identify the dangers. What are the dangers that we face? Then is to acquire the skills to face up to this. I mean, journalism, when we became journalists, we all knew that we were going to have a job that was going to be a little bit different than most of the others, right? We knew that there were some inherent characteristics in journalism that were dangerous. So, but we need to acquire the skills to counter those dangers and do our job. So likewise, let's acquire the skills and make sure that we understand the dangers, we identify the dangers, and we know how to deal with them. And the next step is to apply them in our day-to-day work. Quickly, how do we prepare ourselves in this online workspace? Where I started, do not for a moment think that the online space is not dangerous. It is dangerous, it is toxic, it is unrelenting. And sometimes the threats, because they are virtual, can be virulent, more virulent than what you would get offline, right? Some of the abuse that the female colleagues or colleagues from minority communities get are probably the vilest that I have seen. And so it's unrelenting, it doesn't let up, and it could feel much more virulent than what it is offline, right? Now, Weng also spoke about creating boundaries. These boundaries are very, very important. We have to create boundaries between work and life, but that's a larger discussion. But for this, create boundaries between your personal and your professional, not only social media usage, but also online usage. And this is as simple as your profiles, your social media profiles, as in like, do I use the same profile for my personal engagements and my professional engagements? And content. What is the content that I would share with my friends? And would I share that in my journalism profiles? These are larger discussions that we have, but these are starting points. And usage. Keep a track of usage. You know, how many hours do I use or am I online for my work? And then how many hours am I online looking or chatting with my friends? Now, the issue now is that because of the lockdowns, because of the restrictions on mobility, most of our interactions in the last year and a half with others have been virtual. We talk to our children's teachers on Zoom. I speak to my friends on Zoom. And then I do my interviews also on Zoom. So we need to create those boundaries and breaks. Wang spoke about it. Breaks are really important. And I can't emphasize more about creating long-term and short-term breaks. And these are very, very personal decisions, right? Hardware, that's a very tricky thing to deal with. And I probably wouldn't go into that in detail. The other one is location. And when I say location is where do we engage online for our work and for our professional life, right? I found out personally that I work better when I have open space in front of me. So that is why I have a wall behind me and open space in front of me. I actually realized that when I change space. So likewise, there are these very simple tricks that you can do. And trauma impact is very personal. And we need to create these very personal boundaries and personal interventions so that we are safe. Next slide, please. So the other one is engagement. The important thing is we need to understand who we engage and why we engage. And this is very important when you are a star journalist and when you get trolled. So do we engage all the trolls? And do we give each and every reaction to our story the same value? So if we prepare ourselves, I think we can face up to this much better, right? Peer support. Again, can't emphasize enough on this, right? Create those networks. Each one of you who have come into these sessions is a clog in that peer support network. I first attended an Art Center workshop in 2011. And when I went back to Sri Lanka, when I spoke about trauma and journalism, people thought that I had lost something in the flight or somewhere else. But today, everyone's talking about it. So don't think because there is this pushback from the community. Like Wen said that there are others who want to be Superman or Superwoman journalists, that they think they're bulletproof, that you shouldn't talk about this. It is weak who don't show that they're vulnerable. It is actually the stronger and the strongest who show that they're vulnerable, because then they will acquire the skills not only for themselves, but for the community, right? And finally, don't ever think that online is not going to jump to offline. We have had really bad experiences about this. I have lost dear friends because they didn't pay heed to the online threats, the abuse that they were getting and the kind of manifestations they were getting offline as well. So this is extreme, the last one, and it may not be applicable to each one of us, but that doesn't mean that it cannot happen. So that is it from me for now, but I want to, before I hand over to Kamina, I just want to emphasize that three things that we always talk about. We need to create that social support within the journalism community. And that support starts with each one of us. Each one of us creates that support, and we create that network. And that network is regional, which is what it is now. It's local, it's national, and it could be organizational as well. And then physical health, take breaks. Do what you like, do what is fun, go out, run, dance in the rain. As long as you don't harm others, I think it'll be fine. And give ourselves purpose. Right now, journalism matters more than before. And because of that, we need to do this, but we need to do this safely, because if the experience don't do this safely, then the world we live in will not be getting the right information that it needs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amantha. And I just sort of quickly presented that slide as it's exactly what you're talking about, those three kind of main areas to focus on. So now I'm going to close down the slide show so that we can all see each other and open up for conversation. We've got about another kind of 20, 25 minutes between us, and there's some questions which are coming in, so that's fantastic. Thank you so much, and we'll have a look at some of them as we go. But I just wanted to sort of I wanted to kick off and go back to you, Weng, and just ask, what do you, thinking about that idea that we kind of propagate, that purpose, that sense of kind of there's a kind of moral journey or moral mission that I'm on, that my journalism is a part of, that I'm shining that torch in the darkness and hopefully making changing lives as a result. How is that threatened by what we are experiencing at the moment through not just the COVID pandemic, but the misinformation and disinformation pandemic as well? And how in particular do you think this affects investigative journalists and investigative journalism?
Well, right now there are a lot of attacks against journalists and journalism, and most of it are being done through digital platforms like the social media platforms. The idea that journalism is no longer important, or the idea that journalists are biased, they represent oligarchs, and they don't listen, they don't portray what is really happening, but are actually choosing what to present to the public. All of these take their toll, and even if people don't initially believe in them, but because they are kept being repeated over and over, they start to gain traction. And this is something that we would like also to fight. And a lot of news organizations are doing programs to do this, such as news literacy campaigns, making people understand what journalism is to the society. How journalists do their work, from simple, how do you do interviews? How do you choose your sources? How do you craft your articles? These are things that help people to understand. And especially for investigative journalists, it creates a lot of barrier, because some sources may be affected and would not give you any more information, believing that you are not giving a complete picture, or you're not being fair. So this is a challenge right now, for journalism. And in the Philippines, for example, if you have the president himself, bashing members of media, shutting down news organizations, filing cases against Rappler, for example, and and so on. Then it becomes, as Amantha said, it becomes not just a threat in the digital world, but it translates into the physical. And for my organization, that's something that's really very real, because we were shut down and we lost so many colleagues. More than 6,000 lost their jobs because of those actions. So this is a fight that we need to fight. It's not something that we wish would just go away, because elections are coming in the Philippines next year. So people are really saying, oh, let's just wait for the next president. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad for journalism and for journalists in the Philippines next year. But I don't think it's going to go away that easily, because the fight is not just in how the president gives his statement. It's also now become cultural. So education has to be addressed. People's understanding of democracy has to be strengthened, and people should be willing to fight for that democracy. And this is what Maria Ressa has shown us, actually. So we're very proud of her. We're very happy that the Nobel Peace Committee recognized her and the importance of journalism, not just in the Philippines, but globally. I hope I was able to answer your question. I'm sorry if I...
No, that was a great answer. I think what I took from that is that it's almost as if the journalism community has become a marginalized community. Historically, we have reported on marginalized communities and reported on the injustices that we see in marginalized communities. And in some respects, that has become our job to, advocate for ourselves in the way that potentially historically we have advocated for others who don't have a voice. So it's an interesting ethical dilemma then, because it's turning those skills onto something that is about, survival of our profession and the noble profession that it is. So a kind of related question, I guess, to some extent, comes from Yoshiko in Japan, who is a freelance journalist who has a disability. And Amantha, I thought you might have a perspective on this, because you identified that experiences of people who are, I think you said, already in kind of minority groups, it is so much more amplified, some of these issues. Yoshiko says that she has a chronic complex discrimination against females with disabilities, and she doesn't feel that she can gain support from disability advocates because she sometimes reports against the government, and there doesn't seem to be that sort of support there for her. What do you think, what sort of advice, practical advice would you offer someone in that situation, knowing that it's probably fairly specific to her own experience, but what sort of general advice can you provide?
I think to start off is that when she approaches her journalism, to approach it with that understanding that she is venturing into a minefield, that this is not walking into a coffee shop. This is not walking into a friendly place. Even though you are doing this for a purpose that you think that you have given value, others will not. That doesn't mean that the value that you give to this job that you've taken over is worthless. That means others don't see it that way. But you prepare yourself. You prepare yourself that you're going to get these kind of reactions. And also, where do you get these kind of reactions? Where do you kind of get these threats or trolling? If it's online, acquire those online skills, and also create those cutouts where it allows you to do your job. But I would also stress on the fact that creating that community, that very personal as well as that professional community, where you can discuss these things and build awareness, and also work within that very safe network. So to start off, start off by always assuming and being prepared that your reporting, your job is going to thrust you into a situation or situations where you will feel uncomfortable, where you will feel that people are targeting you and targeting you more than others. Then work from that position, but create that safety net, around you so that you feel safe and you can go ahead doing your job.
Thank you. Well, that sort of makes me, that emphasis that you've both given throughout this afternoon's presentation on the fight the isolation. I think, Weng, that was your words, fight the isolation. And it's made me wonder about whether or not we need more of a culture shift within the journalism community, because there is a kind of historical sense that we are competing against each other, and then we've got to get first to the story and push everyone out of the way to get my question in. And I'm not meaning physically, I'm meaning metaphorically. And so how do we sort of take that into this new environment that we all find ourselves in and maintain our sense of professionalism and healthy competitiveness, but also build and support each other in a community? Any ideas from that, Weng?
That can also be physical, not just metaphorical. My experience, when you talk about trauma, it actually cuts across the different news organizations, because it's something that is not usually addressed in their own respective news organizations. So when the journalists come together, and even if they're coming from different platforms, different companies, different media houses, it's actually something that can bind them. It can help them, work together. And this is what the peer support did in our case. We asked different journalists from different parts of the Philippines to be peer supporters. And when Haiyan happened, we actually transported journalists coming from southern Philippines, from northern Philippines, and they came to Tacloban, where the Haiyan super typhoon hit really hard, and they assisted in doing psychosocial first aid for the journalists who are based in the areas that were hit by the super typhoon, not just in Tacloban, but also in other areas, in other provinces, because it was such a big calamity. And because you have this group that is responding to an issue that they feel are not being addressed in their own media houses, it's actually helped to unite and to prevent that isolation. If you feel that there's no one but you who's suffering, and no one is interested in what you're going through, then you become isolated. But learning that there are people willing to travel from as far as Zamboanga, and this is really very far. Airfare is expensive, but willing to travel to just to help you and talk to you, help you process this experience. That creates a sense of being loved or being cared for. So that's one way of addressing it. Being part of this network, and organizational support is very, very important. That's why I was saying, don't let the crisis take advantage of it, because it's there for us. It's happening and it's affecting us anyway. So let's use it and use this opportunity to push for actions, for measures, for reforms within our own companies and within the journalism community to address the issue of stress and trauma and burnout, because you've had a lot of journalists who, I know so many who have recently left journalism because of this.
Samantha, that's a lovely, well, not the thought that journalists have left, but that journalists will travel to support each other. So obviously, back in the world of metaphor and on the digital front line, we may not be able to travel physically, but I sense that too, that I'm seeing more and more this idea of we need to build our community of peer support, and we need to be available for each other and cheer and support each other. And Amantha, that's your job, or it's one of your jobs anyway, that you do for the Dart Centre Asia Pacific, is that you coordinate journalists across the region. Would you like to talk to a little bit more on how we build that peer support, how we build that collegiality?
It starts off by being empathetic towards others, by understanding what people go through. And I think we need to, at least I had to make a very pivotal shift, because I grew up I became a journalist in an environment which strived and idealized the bulletproof journalist who goes out, brings all these stories, writes them, types away, then goes off as if like nothing impacts them. I think we need to change that. We need to understand that emotional impact and mental well-being are no longer peripheral to journalism, that they are actually a core concern. And in terms of building networks, it's more about understanding each situation. Because like Weng said, each situation faced by each journalist, each situation in different countries is different. So, but initially, most of the time, working in South Asia, working in Asia, the most difficult part was beginning the conversation. Let's talk about how our work impacts us mentally, because most journalists still feel that goes against the grain of being a journalist. This is the tough guy journalist who walks in as if like nothing impacts them. And I think as the Dart Centre, as representatives of the Dart Centre, one of the key starting points for us was to go out there and start that conversation and create that safe space for colleagues to come out and say, look, let's talk about this. And I often talk about my experience. And then you start off from that. And I think building those networks and keeping in touch. And we always talk about how the digital and the virtual is always nasty, but there's so much good. Without the digital appliances, without digital connectivity, we wouldn't be doing this. We wouldn't be doing this Zoom session. I wouldn't be talking to Wen or even to you, Kamina. So there is so much of good. And I think right now we are given, like Wen said, don't let the crisis go to waste. Everyone's on these digital networks and they're becoming cheaper and more effective. So we need to use them to build these networks. And as the Dart Centre, I think our role is to promote and work as a catalyst that brings them together. And we are doing that. But I think like we have come a long way from where we started, but we have a long, long way to go. So it's a long journey.
Yeah, thank you. I like to also think about it from the point of view of we actually have the skills. One kind of lucky coincidence, I guess, is that the skills we need to support ourselves and each other are inherent in the skills we need to do for journalism work. Listening, asking questions, exploring, being curious, connecting one heart with another, one person with another, looking to always the bigger picture, the bigger story, the bigger kind of reason for why something is happening, including why something is happening to me. So I leave that there as well. We've only got less than 10 minutes left together. So if you do have any last questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. There's a couple we haven't yet got to. So I'm going to sort of look towards those now. And that's connected with, well, it's the question, two questions come from the same person, but one of them was about how do you inspire young journalists to enter this area, this minefield, this digital frontline and other frontlines that we've been talking about. And I suspect the answer is to kind of really continue to build that sense of purpose and connection. And I'll ask Weng to speak to that. And then the other question in just a second. And then the other question is really about self-care and supporting yourself through, how do you support other people when you yourself are feeling kind of stress and burnout? I guess that's the nature of the question. And so maybe Amantha, you can think about that one and come up with some thoughts there. So Weng, yes, what should we say to young idealistic 18-year-olds who want this career and then think, what on earth would I do that for?
Well, we need to tell them that trauma is cumulative. So it's for their own health, for their own interest to learn about this and to take care. And because the mental state of your colleague, the one you go with during coverages, it's also would have impact on you, on the entire team. So it's important for you to take care of yourself and for you to take care of your peer, of your fellow journalists. So I mean, that's survival, right? So that's the most basic. So it's something that if you tell them that you need this, you need to learn about this, you need to practice this because this is for your own survival, for your own health. And also knowing about trauma, about stress, how they happen, it makes you good journalists, right? You said we have the skills. We know how to ask the questions. So it's applying these skills and knowing that using them the right way. Recognizing trauma, for example, on the person that you're interviewing would allow you to think of how to ask the question better. Taking care not to harm again the person, not for him to experience again the injury. That makes you a better interviewer. It makes you a better journalist. It makes you a better human being, actually. So this is something that young journalists should study. And I don't know if in other countries, if journalism trauma is part of the curriculum. In the Philippines, it's not. So it's something that should be included so that when they finally graduate and join the workforce, they would be more equipped. They would have that, at least that initial knowledge that would allow them to be more careful and also help others. And this is what I like about this, because it's not just you. Because if you know the issue, you know what trauma is all about, you don't just take care of yourself. You tend to also take care of the person beside you, of the people around you. It comes naturally to you.
Thank you. Yes, good advice. Amantha, what advice do you have to someone who's a bit of a mentor, an editor who has a team and feels the experience of stress and burnout and then needing to support others?
Well, I mean, if they're that kind of a managerial position, you have to give yourself value that others depend on you. And if you don't take care of yourself, you're not only letting yourself down, but you are probably letting a lot of others down as well. And one of the hardest things, and I hope and pray that this doesn't happen again, is to work in isolation. Not only isolation as in alone, but not being able to have that physical mobility that we are used to. Now, in that kind of a situation, I think it's very, very important that we create breaks. Short, in a very kind of like concise way, think of journalism as being in a treadmill, especially when you are reporting a high intense story like COVID spread or something like that. And you cannot do that. You need to take breaks. You need to create those breaks into your work routine. And that's the start. There are lots of tips on that at the Dart Center website as well. But I think that is the start. If you are a manager, give yourself value that others depend on you, and also look at your work routine and work those breaks into them.
Wonderful. We haven't got any other questions that we haven't answered. So I just thought, and we're pretty much right on time too. So I just thought I would just invite both of you to just have last thoughts. Your number one, maybe self-care tip. What do you do that is most effective for you? I'll start with you, Amanda.
Well, I mean, what I do is that when I started off working in this remote working environment, I was glued to a screen, and I was working on a screen more than 8 hours a day. And the biggest and the most effective change that I have made is to create those breaks. Those breaks are short and long. When I work, I make sure that, again, I use the digital tools that I have to my advantage. I have a timer going, and I know whether I have stayed on the screen for an hour or more, and I take breaks. And then I kind of work my work day into such a way that there are breaks that I take at the end of it. And sometimes works become very hectic, as happened to me last month. But then I make sure, okay, I'm going to work that month. It's going to be intense, but I'm going to make sure that I have some free days afterwards. So weekends matter, time spent with family, friends matter, doing physical stuff, whether it's exercise, yoga, anything that you like. And now that restrictions are easy, meeting up with friends, I think that's the most important thing for me. Creating those breaks, first understanding that, but very, very proactively implementing that. It doesn't come easy. I can tell you, if you have been a journalist, the longer that you've been a journalist, you just want to be on that thrill of the chase, of chasing that story down. You have to be proactive.
Beautiful, thank you. Weng, your top self-care tip? Or any other last thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to answer directly what Helen wrote.
Please.
That editor, how can I encourage and improve morale within my team of journalists as they battle pandemic fatigue and burnout, while I am also battling these things? Very simple, just asking how they are. Actually, it's already a big help. We have experienced similar, because of the very terrible experience that our company has gone through with being attacked and with the shutdown. A lot of our colleagues, other journalists and other members of the other employees have really been traumatized, not knowing whether you still have a job while the congressional hearing was ongoing and whether to give us the franchise or not. It was such a difficult year. But when you simply ask people, how are you doing today? Let's have coffee, let's talk about it. That was already such a big thing. And they actually appreciated it, and even and because they felt good when it was done to them, they also did it to the others. So it's like something that catches fire. You don't need to treat them to, of course, if you have money, you can treat them to lunch or something. That would be nice. But just asking how people are and making them feel that you are concerned about them. That's actually already such a big thing. Creating conversations, organizing something that would allow you to see each other and talk and exchange feelings and experiences. That's already major. And that would even help you because Helen says that she herself is also battling these things, the fatigue, the burnout. Then sharing your own story is also a way to help yourself.
Wonderful. I'm going to kind of wrap all this up together to just quick reminders for everybody. Those three kind of key things. Hang on tight to your sense of purpose, not just for this story that you're working on, but your whole career. Keep those social connections with anyone who's important to you in your life, and keep your body moving, keep the energy flowing. And I just want to add something which is, about that social support, which is the power is in the question. Going back to that thought about we already have these skills. We don't always have to have the solution, but just being heard, having an opportunity to say, this is what's my truth, is the power in itself. So provide yourself, your friends, your colleagues, your team with that opportunity. So on that, I think we're getting the wrap up. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Weng and Amantha. It's great to have you here in this conversation, and it's lovely to be here with everybody else. So enjoy the rest of the conference and see you next time.
Thank you.
Nina, thanks everybody.